The hallway went silent the second the handcuffs clicked, not because a crime had been proven, but because a story had already been decided. A black student, new to the school, stood frozen against a locker, while a police officer tightened the cuffs around his wrists and said 4 words that changed everything. "You assaulted my son." No questions, no witnesses, no chance to explain. Just a badge, a lie, and a room full of people who chose silence. But what no one knew yet was that justice was already walking toward the door. The sound of metal biting into metal cut through the hallway before anyone understood what it meant. Click! That single sound froze the entire building in place. Conversations died mid-sentence. Lockers stopped slamming. Laughter collapsed into silence. A brand new black boy stood pressed against a cold blue locker, his cheek scraping chipped paint, his breath uneven, his hands trembling as a grown man tightened steel around his wrists like he was locking away a threat instead of a child. He didn't cry, not yet, but his chest burned like it wanted to cave in on itself. He had been at the school for 3 days. 3. He still didn't know which. Stairwell led to the science wing. Still counted his steps between classes so he wouldn't be late. Still sat at the edge of the lunch table, smiling politely, trying to disappear into the background. His mother had told him to keep his head down. His grandmother had told him to speak only when spoken to. He had listened. He always listened. But none of that mattered now. The officer's hand was Evie. Not shaking. Not unsure. Firm. Confident. Like this moment had been waiting for him. The badge on his chest caught the fluorescent lights and reflected them back into the boy's eyes, sharp and blinding. "You assaulted my son," the officer said, flat and final, like he was reading a weather report. No anger, no doubt, just ownership of the truth. The words didn't just land, they echoed. They bounced off lockers and tile floors and settled into the ears of everyone watching. The accusation grew bigger than the boy himself, bigger than the hallway, bigger than the truth. Across the hall stood a white student with swollen knuckles and a shallow cut near his eyebrow. He leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't look scared. He didn't look worried. He didn't have to say a word. His father wore the badge. A teacher stood 10 feet away, her mouth slightly open, hands clutching a stack of papers she had dropped when the cuffs came out. She didn't step forward. Another teacher pretended to look down the hallway, suddenly fascinated by a fire exit sign. The security guard stayed planted by the doors, radio silent, eyes careful. Everyone. E was watching. No one was helping. Whispers began to move like insects, quiet, fast, hungry. "Did you see that? I knew something was off about him. He's only been here a few days." Phones slipped into hands like they had been waiting for this moment. Screens lit up, cameras angled. The boy saw his reflection in the glass of a trophy case. His hoodie wrinkled, his backpack half unzipped. "Hi." His face pale, eyes wide, lips parted like he was about to apologize for something he hadn't done. He tried to speak. "Sir." The word barely made it past his throat. The officer didn't turn, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the sound. He tugged the cuffs tighter instead. Not enough to break skin, just enough to remind the boy who was in control. "I didn't do anything," the boy said, louder now, his voice cracking in a way he hated. He fell. "I was just... save it." The officer snapped, finally looking back at him. His eyes weren't angry, they were bored, like he had heard this story too many times already. The boy swallowed hard. His mouth tasted like metal, his ears rang. He looked around, searching faces, hoping someone, anyone, would meet his eyes, hoping a teacher would step forward and say they saw what really happened, hoping another student would speak, hoping the truth would matter more than the badge. Eyes slid away. A girl he had shared a textbook with the day before stared at her shoes. A boy he had nodded at in math class raised his phone higher. A teacher adjusted her glasses. Silence did the rest. He already knew this feeling. He hated that he did. He had seen it on the news, heard it in his uncle's voice, felt it in his mother's TI. Hugs when he walked out the door. That sinking certainty that the ending had been written before the story even started. Black boy, white badge, no witnesses that mattered. The officer began walking, pulling him along like luggage. The cuffs scraped his wrists with every step. Each footfall echoed too loud in the quiet hall. Students pressed back against lockers to make space. Their faces a mix of shock, curiosity, and something else the boy recognized instantly. Relief. Relief. It wasn't them. As he passed the white student, their eyes met for half a second. There was no guilt there, no apology. Just a flicker of something smug, something protected. The boy felt heat rush to his face, shame rising faster than fear. Shame for being seen like this, shame for not being believed, shame for knowing he would carry this moment with him long after the cuffs came off. If they ever did. They reached the front doors. Sunlight poured in through the glass, too bright, too normal for what was happening. The officer pushed the door open with his shoulder. The sound of it swinging wide felt like the end of something, or the beginning of something worse. Outside, a patrol car waited to teach. E-curb. Engine idling. Door open. Ready. A small crowd had gathered. A few parents. A janitor on break. A security guard from the middle school across the street. Everyone watched as the officer guided the boy toward the car, one hand firm on his arm, the other resting casually near his belt. The boy's heart hammered so hard he thought it might give him away. Like fear was something they could charge him for, too. He looked up at the sky, blue and empty, and thought of his mother. Thought of how she kissed his forehead that morning and told him to have a good day. Thought of how excited she had been about the transfer, about the fresh start, about the better school. A siren chirped as the door closed. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to seal the moment in place. Final. As the car pulled away, the school resumed breathing. Conversations restarted. Bells rang. Lockers slammed. Life moved on, stepping neatly over the wreckage left behind. But something had shifted. A quiet lesson settled into the walls of that building, heavy and unspoken. A lesson about who gets questioned and who gets believed. About how quickly authority can turn into a weapon. About how power doesn't need proof when it already has privilege. And somewhere in the back seat of a patrol car, a boy stared at his cuffed hands and wondered how 3 days had turned into this. He wondered how long this story would follow him. He wondered if anyone would ever hear him say the truth and decide it was enough. The car disappeared around the corner. The hallway stayed silent just a little too long. The station smelled like metal and old coffee, a bitter mix that clung to the back of the boy's throat the moment he was led inside. The walls were a dull gray, scuffed and tired, like they had seen too many nights like this and stopped caring how they looked. The lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering just enough to make time feel uneven. Every sound echoed. Every breath felt louder than it should have. The officer sat comfortably behind the desk. His chair leaned back slightly, one leg crossed over the other. A pen moved steadily across paper as he filled out forms with calm precision. No rush, no tension, just routine, like this was another task to complete before dinner. Across from him, the boy sat on a hard metal chair bolted to the floor, wrists aching where the cuffs had been removed only minutes earlier, red marks already rising on his skin like quiet accusations. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second felt heavy. Each minute felt like it was taking something from him. He attacked my son, the officer said again, not looking up. His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It didn't even sound angry. It sounded settled. Inal. Like gravity. Like something that did not need to be questioned. Not a claim, a fact. The boy stared at the floor, then at the wall, then finally at the desk. He opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed hard. His chest felt tight, like his words were stuck behind something solid. When he finally spoke, his voice came out thinner than he wanted it to. He tripped, the boy said. I tried to. Help him up. The room didn't react. The pen didn't stop moving. The officer didn't look up. The words floated in the air for a moment, then fell to the floor unseen, unheard, unwanted. The boy's shoulders slumped just a little. Not in defeat. In understanding. No lawyer was called. No explanation was given. No one said he had the right to remain silent or the right to call home. The process ved forward without him, around him, through him. Papers were stamped. A drawer opened. Keys jingled. Then the cell door closed. It wasn't loud. It didn't slam. It clicked shut softly, almost politely. But the sound hit him harder than the siren had. It echoed inside his chest, deep and hollow, louder than it had any right to be. He stood there for a moment, alone. the room smaller than it looked. Ed, the bench cold beneath his fingers. The air felt heavier now, like it pressed down on his shoulders. He had never been in a place like this before. Never thought he would be. He tried to keep his breathing steady, counting in his head the way his grandmother had taught him when he got nervous. In through the nose, out through the mouth. It didn't help. Somewhere across town, the school kept moving. Bells rang. Classes changed. Lunch trays clattered. And the story spread faster than the truth ever could. Violent transfer student, troublemaker, arrested on day 3. The words slipped from mouth to mouth, growing sharper each time. By the end of the day, no one remembered that he had been quiet, that he had kept his head down, that he had tried not to be noticed. The label stuck easy. Than the facts ever would. Meanwhile, the officer's son sat at home on the couch, controller in hand, eyes glued to a screen glowing with color and noise. His knuckles were still sore, but not enough to stop him from playing. His version of the story had already been accepted, already protected, already wrapped in the weight of his father's badge. He didn't think about the boy sitting in a CE. He didn't have to. Hours passed slowly at the station. The boy shifted on the bench, stood up, sat back down. Hunger crept in quietly, then loudly. Fear followed, not the sharp kind. The dull kind that settled in and refused to leave. He wondered if his mother knew where he was. He wondered if she was worried. He wondered how he would explain this to her without sounding like he was making excuses. When she finally arrived, the room seemed to change temperature. She came in fast, eyes red, hair pulled back in a rush, purse clutched tight against her side. She was smaller than the officer, shorter, her clothes plain and wrinkled from the day. But the moment she saw her son through the glass, something fierce crossed her face. She rushed forward, called his name, pressed her hand against the barrier like she could reach him through it. "What is this?" she asked, turning to the officer. "Why is my child here?" Her voice shook, but not with weakness. With fear held back just long enough to speak. The officer stood slowly, smoothing his uniform, his movements controlled. He explained calmly, too calmly. He spoke about procedures, about reports, about allegations. He spoke like he was reciting policy, not describing a boy's life unraveling. She begged, she reasoned. She tried logic first, then mercy. She told him her son had never been in trouble. Told him they had moved for a better school. Told him he was a good kid, a respectful kid. A kid who helped old neighbors carry groceries and came straight home after class. Tears slipped down her face anyway. The officer never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He stood on the other side, the desk, arms relaxed, posture open, confident in the cyst. That stood behind him like a wall. He told her court would decide. He told her to trust the process. He believed the law was on his side, or maybe he just believed it always would be. Court was scheduled quickly, too quickly, before questions could be asked, before stories could be checked, before doubt could creep in where certainty had already planted its flag. The days leading up to it, blurred together for the boy. The cell, the bench, the sound of keys, the taste of cheap food, the weight of his mother's hand on his shoulder when she visited, trying to be strong for both of them. Nights were the hardest. The quiet left too much room for thoughts to grow. He replayed the hallway over and over, the fall, the shove, the look on the other boy's face, the sound of the cuffs. He wondered how a moment could be twisted so easily into something else. He wondered how many people were already convinced he was exactly what they expected him to be. When the day of court came, the chains felt heavier than he expected. They clinked softly as he walked, each step reminding him that this wasn't a nightmare, that this was happening. He kept his eyes forward just like he'd been told, but he could feel the room watching him as he was led in. The courtroom was bigger than he imagined. Wood and stone and flags and seals. It smelled different from station. Cleaner, sharper, like authority polished itself here. He felt smaller than ever. The officer sat behind the prosecution table, arms crossed, back straight, face calm. He didn't look at the boy when he entered. He didn't need to. He already knew how this was supposed to go. He had told his version of the story enough times that it felt like truth even to him. The boy sat beside his mother. She squeezed his hand gently as if reminding him he was still here, still human, still her son. The room settled. Papers rustled. Chairs scraped. The judge had not yet entered, but the weight of the system already pressed down on the boy's chest. He could feel it in the way people avoided his eyes, in the way whispers died when he looked up. Justice, it seemed, already knew who it was meant to serve, or so everyone thought. The judge's door remained closed. The clock ticked. The officer adjusted his posture, slightly, confident, patient, certain. The boy swallowed hard and stared straight ahead, unaware that everything he believed about this moment was about to be tested, and that the silence filling the room was not an ending, but a pause before something shifted. The courtroom doors opened slowly, not with a bang, not with drama, but with a measured creak that carried more weight than noise ever could. Every head turned at once. Conversations died where they stood. Even the air seemed to still, like it knew something important was about to happen. And in that quiet, everything shifted. The judge walked in with an unhurried stride, his robe moving gently with each step. He wasn't tall in a way that demanded attention, but he carried himself like someone who had learned long ago that presence mattered more than volume. His hair was silvered with age. His face was calm, steady, the kind of face that had seen too much to be easily surprised. A black man, older, respected. The kind of man who didn't need to announce authority because authority already knew his name. He took his seat slowly, eyes scanning the room with a quiet patience that felt heavier than judgment. He looked at the walls, the seal behind him, the tables, the lawyers, the spectators. Then his gaze landed on the boy sitting beside his mother, wrists still chained, shoulders pulled in like he was. Trying to make himself smaller, the judge's eyes lingered there. Just for a moment, it was enough. Across the room, the officer shifted in his chair. It was subtle, barely noticeable, a straightening of the spine, a tightening of the jaw. The confidence he had worn so easily since the beginning suddenly felt heavier, like a coat that no longer fit the room. The clerk called the court to order. The ritual began. Names, charges, formal words spoken in practiced tones. But the judge did not rush. He listened, really listened. Not just to what was said, but to how it was said, to what was missing, to the spaces between sentences. The officer took the stand with the same ease he had shown at the station. He spoke clearly, calmly. He described the hallway incident as if it were simple. Anne. He said his son had been attacked, said the boy had acted aggressively, said he intervened to prevent further harm. He used words like protocol and reasonable force. He painted himself as a father first, an officer second, a man forced into action. The boy sat very still as he listened. His hands were clasped together, chains resting against his knees. His mother's hand was on his back, ubbing small circles, grounding him. He didn't look at the officer. He couldn't. He stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, heart pounding so loud he wondered if anyone else could hear it. The judge nodded occasionally as the officer spoke. Not in agreement, not in disagreement, just acknowledgement. He asked a few clarifying questions, simple ones, neutral ones. The officer answered them easily. He had told this story enough times that it rolled off his tongue like memory instead of invention. When the officer finished, the room felt settled again, like the path forward was already paved. Then the judge leaned forward slightly. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it changed the room. He folded his hands together on the bench and looked directly at the officer, not past him, not around him. At him. Officer, he said, his voice low and even, is this your first complaint involving excessive force? The words landed softly, too softly. The room held its breath. The officer blinked, once, twice, his mouth opened, then closed, just for a second, just long enough. His eyes flicked toward his lawyer, then back to the judge. No, he said finally, Your Honor, that. Pause stretched longer than it should have. It echoed louder than the siren ever had. The judge didn't react right away. He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something he already knew. He glanced down at a file on his desk, then back up at the officer. How many? The judge asked. The officer swallowed. I don't have an exact number. The judge leaned back in his chair this time. His gaze sharpened. Not with anger, but with clarity. I do, he said quietly. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The officer's shoulders stiffened further. The confidence in his posture cracked just a little, like ice under pressure. The judge looked to the prosecution table. "I'd like to see the security footage from the school hallway," he said. "All available angles, including audio." There was a brief hesitation, a whisper between attorneys, a rustle of papers. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began. "The footage wasn't initially—" "Now," the judge said, not raising his voice, not repeating himself. The screen at the side of the courtroom flickered to life. The lights dimmed slightly. Every eye turned toward the footage as it loaded, buffering for just a second too long. The boy's stomach dropped. This was it. The hallway appeared on the screen, familiar, bright, ordinary, students moving between classes, laughter, lockers slamming. Then the two boys entered the frame, the white student walking fast, shoulders tense, the black boy a few steps behind, backpack slung low, head slightly down. The video played. The white student turned suddenly. Words were exchanged. Half the audio was faint. Then the shove. Clear, undeniable. The white student's hands pushing forward. The black boy stumbling back, catching himself against the locker. His hands came up immediately, palms open, backing away. The punch came next, quick, angry. The black boy didn't strike back. He stepped sideways, raised his hands higher, fear visible even in the grainy footage. Gasps filled the room. The officer's jaw tightened, his face drained of color frame by frame as the truth unfolded larger than any badge ever could. The room watched in silence as the officer entered the hallway footage next. Watched him grab the boy without hesitation. Watched him ignore the other student completely. The judge let the footage play through twice. Then he turned back to the officer. The man, who had once filled the room with certainty, now looked smaller. Not physically. Something else. His authority, once unquestioned, now sat exposed under fluorescent light. The judge didn't raise his voice when he spoke again. "Remove the cuffs," he said. For a moment, no one moved. Then the bailiff stepped forward, keys jingling. The sound was sharp in the quiet. The cuffs came off slowly. The chains were lifted. The metal fell away. The boy rubbed his wrists instinctively, red marks blooming brighter against his skin. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just breathed. The judge stood then, slowly, fully. "This court exists to protect children," he said, his voice steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "Not your ego. Not your bloodline." He turned his gaze back to the officer who could no longer meet it. "Authority is not a shield," the judge continued, "and a badge does not give you ownership of the truth." The officer said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The judge dismissed charges against the boy right there. No delay, no conditions, just clarity. A quiet sob escaped the boy's mother as she pulled him into her arms. She held him tight, like she was afraid someone might try to take him again if she loosened her grip. The room buzzed with energy now, not chaos, awareness. Something had changed, not just for the boy, for everyone watching. The judge gathered his papers, his expression calm once more. Before leaving, he looked back at the boy one last time. "Stand tall," he said simply. The boy nodded, tears finally slipping free, his chest aching with a mix of relief and disbelief. He stood a little straighter without the chains, not because the room told him to, because he could. As the judge exited through the same doors he had entered, the room remained silent, stunned by what had just happened. Power had changed hands. And for the first time since the hallway, the boy felt something he hadn't dared to feel before. Hope. But outside those doors, consequences still waited, and not everyone was ready for what the truth had just exposed. The words fell into the room like a final gavel strike, clean and undeniable. The charges were dismissed, not whispered, not delayed, spoken out loud for everyone to hear, publicly, firmly, with no room left for argument or pride to hide behind. The sound of it lingered in the air, heavier than any sentence the court could have handed down. The officer didn't move at first. He sat there as if his body hadn't caught up to what his ears had just heard. His badge caught the light when he shifted, and for the first time, it didn't look like armor. It looked like weight, like something pulling him down instead of lifting him up. Before he could gather himself, before he could step away with the quiet confidence he had walked in with, the judge spoke again, his voice steady, precise, unavoidable. An investigation would begin immediately. The words didn't shout, they didn't accuse, they simply existed, solid, certain. The officer's face tightened, not in anger, in calculation, in the sudden realization that the system he trusted without question had just turned its full attention toward him. The badge that once protected him now felt like a spotlight, heavy, exposing, impossible to ignore. Across the room, the boy stood free for the first time since that hallway moment that had changed everything. No chains, no cuffs, just his own weight on his own feet. He didn't rush forward, didn't celebrate. He stood still, He needed a second to understand that no one was about to grab him again, that no one was about to tell him to sit down, that his body finally belonged to him again. His mother wrapped her arms around him before the moment could slip away. She held him tight, pressing her cheek into his shoulder, her hands gripping the back of his jacket like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the... Tears fell freely now. Not loud, not dramatic. Quiet tears. The kind that come not from relief, but from surviving something you weren't sure you'd make it through. The judge looked out over the room one last time. He didn't rush his words. He let the silence do some of the work for him. He knew people were listening now in a way they hadn't been before. He knew moments like this were rare, and that they carried responsibility. This child did nothing wrong, he said. The sentence landed clean, clear, no conditions attached. But even if he had, the judge continued, his eyes moving slowly from face to face, dignity is not optional. No one spoke. No one moved. The words settled deep, not just in the boy's chest, but in the walls of the room itself. The judge gathered his papers, nodded once, and left the courtroom the same way he had entered it. Calm, unrushed, certain. The room slowly exhaled. The officer stood eventually. His movements were stiff now, careful. Conversations followed him with their eyes as he walked out. Here were no looks of sympathy, no nods of respect, just awareness. The kind that comes when power is stripped down to its truth and everyone sees what's left. Outside the courtroom, the world didn't stop. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. People hurried past with their own problems, their own deadlines, their own lives. But for the boy and his mother, everything felt suspended, like they had stepped out of time for just a moment. They walked down the steps together, the afternoon light warm on their faces. The boy blinked against it, squinting like someone who had been indoors too long. He took a deep breath, then another. Each one felt easier than the last. At school, the response came slowly, carefully. Administrators sent emails filled with careful language. Apologies were issued. In meetings behind closed doors. Quiet ones, late ones, no assemblies, no announcements over the loudspeaker. Just words placed gently where they hoped no one would trip over them. Teachers avoided the boy's eyes when he returned weeks later. Some smiled too quickly, others said nothing at all. A few offered soft apologies, their voices low, as if speaking too loudly might remind everyone of what they hadn't done when it mattered. The hallways felt the same, lockers still slammed, bells still rang. But the boy felt different walking through them. He noticed the looks, the whispers that still followed him like shadows. He noticed the way some students moved out of his path, unsure of how to act now that the story had changed but the label hadn't fully caught up. He walked anyway. His D stayed up. Not in defiance. In truth. The officer's son learned his lesson more quietly. There were no cameras, no courtroom speeches, just consequences that arrived slowly, then all at once. Friends who asked questions, parents who looked at him differently. A story that didn't sound so convincing anymore now that the truth had air around it. Lies, he learned, don't age well in the light. And the officer learned something harder. Something no training manual had ever prepared him for. That authority without integrity doesn't just fail. It collapses. It takes everything with it. The respect, the trust, the certainty that once made his steps feel solid. He carried the weight of that lesson long after the investigation began, long after the whispers followed him instead. Weeks turned into months. The boy found his rhythm again. Not because everything was fixed, not because the world suddenly became fair, but because he refused to let that hallway moment be the loudest chapter of his life. He focused on his classes, on basketball practice, on helping his mother with groceries on the weekends, on laughing when he could, on breathing when things felt heavy. Sometimes he caught high, himself standing a little taller than before, not because he had something to prove, because he had something to protect. People still watched him, some always would, but now, when he felt their eyes, he remembered the sound of the judge's voice. Calm, certain. He remembered the feeling of the cuffs coming off, the weight lifting, the truth standing on its own without him having to fight for it. Justice hadn't come from shouting. It hadn't come from anger or force. It had come from truth, from patience, from someone finally willing to look past a badge and see a child. And that lesson stayed, because power and righteousness are not the same thing. They never were. One can be worn, the other must be earned. One can be taken. The other stands on its own, even when no one wants it to. Anywhere down the line the boy would tell this story. Maybe not with anger, maybe not with pride, but with clarity, as proof that silence doesn't always win. That systems can listen, even if it takes time. That dignity isn't something anyone gets to decide for you. And one day, when another door opens quietly in another room, someone will remember this moment. They'll remember that justice doesn't always knock politely or ask for permission. Sometimes it just walks in.